Hippocratic Oath can be summed up into 3 words. Do no harm.
If religion was a thing that money could buy, we're walking in the light. The rich would live and the poor would die. We're walking in the light.
As society gradually lost faith in traditional religion, we began to worship our new deities, scientists. Governments across the world shifted from being controlled by the church to the Church of Scientism. Their sermons taught us heaven could be bought in the form of a big pharma product, and hell was relying upon our God-given immune system. Science has built us grand temples for reverence, but in 1948, our scientific mecca was formed, the World Health Organization. This church has dictated the lives of everyone on the planet, even the unfaithful, but especially the excommunicated. But now the clergy are beginning to ask the question, after generations of faithful worship of their products, why has the world become unhealthier? Which is why we need to rename our church to reflect the World Health Organization's true pursuits.
The World Death Organization do no harm unless we directly benefit. The hypocritical oath.
Knowledge is power. Will science use that power for good or evil? Does science, medical science in particular, have the moral authority to kill a human in an attempt to better humanity? Or are these people merely murderers playing God? Here lies the conundrum within eugenics. Translated from Greek meaning good genes. Is it justifiable to kill or sterilize an individual to prevent the passing of their supposed bad genes? Before eugenics was coined as a term, eugenics was the accepted practice of every documented human civilization. After all, everyone just wants to have a healthy baby.
My name is Lila Hart. I was born with a congenital birth defect called spina bifida. If it were up to eugenics, I would have never been born. Because of my disability, eugenics categorizes me as having bad genes that should not be passed on to future generations. Eugenics instructs medical science to abort me, force permanent sterilization upon me, or even remove my reproductive organs. I am one of the fortunate few who escaped the wrath of the World Death Organization.
My name is Abbenante. Today you are going to learn the history of scientific eugenics. Eugenics is a set of theories, a philosophy. Scientific eugenics is the philosophy of eugenics applied to scientific pursuits to kill, abort, and sterilize the human population considered to have bad genes. This vague concept of bad genes targets a specific set of groups within humanity. Proponents of scientific eugenics have successfully justified the murders of more human beings than any group in human history. We present to you the unprecedented documentation of the history of scientific eugenics, because the most powerful people on Earth understand that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. According to eugenics, if the baby has bad genes, we throw that baby out with the bathwater. This has been the reality for disabled people since the dawn of time. As far back as ancient Greece and Rome, infanticide of disabled or unwanted children was a documented and accepted practice. Mentally disabled were considered a danger to property and their families. As far back as 1676, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts mandated guardians who maintained control and custody of mentally disabled. Guardians and doctors had the authority to compel forced permanent sterilization. Thanks to the Supreme Court, by 1938, 37 states enforced involuntary sterilization laws. Today, permanent compulsory sterilization of disabled people is legal in 31 states. Eugenic sterilization and forced sterilization laws spread like an epidemic in America by expanding to idiots, the poor, drunks, deaf, insane, criminals, and the feeble-minded. The logic of eugenics culminated into its current form, an agenda of depopulation. The concern of overpopulation was first postulated by Thomas Malthus in 1798. Malthusian theory states that population will increase at a rate past food production, leading to a large portion of the population starving in poor conditions. War, famine, and epidemics are positive checks to the population that are the inevitable results of misery and vice. Happiness is the ability to maintain a family and independence, and any obstacle to the creation of a family is a sign of misery and vice. Malthusian theory simultaneously argues that the family is the only source of happiness, and that there are not enough resources on Earth to sustain everyone having a family. Malthusian theory was created to ignore the obvious. An abundance of resources is not a problem for population, but for profits. Overpopulation is a ruse for elite producers to maintain profits by murdering and sterilizing the most vulnerable of society. Charles Darwin, influenced by Malthusian theory, presented the theory of natural selection. Natural selection argues social animals will adapt the species to benefit the community. This cruel scientific theory victim blames the subjects of rape, murder, sterilization, and extinction by stating they were not fit enough to avoid the circumstance. Francis Galton utilized Darwinian theory as the basis for scientific racism. Natural selection and survival of the fittest theories were proposed as the rationalization for displacing the Negro race. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, utilized Darwinian theory of selection to argue for mandating mixed marriages for deaf and disabled people to prevent the passing of their genes. A convenient argument considering he himself was married to a deaf woman, a pupil of his since she was a teenager. In 1883, Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, a microcosm of Darwinian and Malthusian theory boiled down into one word. Galton argues for the replacement of inferior races to prevent misery, and defines this as the base motivation for eugenics. A eugenic practice of gradual outnumbering and replacing of a supposedly inferior race or group has become the dominant directive of the most powerful humans on Earth. 50 years after eugenics was a term, manifest destiny of eugenics spread through the American legal system and scientific community. Eugenics became the religion of the powerful, faithful, to an agenda of depopulation. All that remained was to convince the public eugenics didn't exist. Omitting eugenics from history facilitates the cover-up of the largest crime in humanity's history. This group of scientific eugenicists will forever be known
as the World Death Organization.
Commonwealth of Massachusetts laws set the legal foundation for control of in-state facilities, hospitals, and prisons. Schools for feeble-minded, imbeciles, deaf and dumb sprung up around the country. Eugenic sterilization laws were vetoed starting in 1897 due to the lack of legal precedent until the Supreme Court laid out the legal framework for eugenics in 1905. Jacobson versus Massachusetts stated our liberty is not an absolute right in the context of vaccinations. Citing the safety of the public, the state retains the right to mandate vaccinations using police power. The Supreme Court upheld Massachusetts law stating compulsory vaccination is an absolute rule, even if the adult would die from vaccination. A curious court decision considering a few years prior, children died from diphtheria and smallpox vaccine contamination. Eugenic sterilization laws finally had a legal precedent thanks to Jacobson versus Massachusetts. 1907, Indiana passed the first eugenic sterilization law for prisoners deemed to be mentally ill, explicitly stating their motives were purely eugenic. California would pass eugenic sterilization laws, leading to more sterilizations than any other state. Virginia's 1924 eugenic sterilization law was cited in the Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck, a student at Virginia's colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded, was sterilized by her superintendent without consent. Due to Darwinian theory, Buck's lineage of illegitimacy and mental disability deemed her unfit for procreation. For the welfare of the community, Carrie Buck's sterilization was justified, and mandatory vaccination laws were the precedent. Jacobson versus Massachusetts is broad enough to cover sterilization. The Supreme Court affirmed guilty of the crime of being unfit to procreate. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, a eugenic concept reigning supreme over the American justice system.
Margaret Sanger is the godmother of eugenics. Sprung from her womb were the ideas of Malthus, Darwin, and Galton in one term: birth control. Birth control is the evolution of eugenics in modern form. The tenets of birth control were conceived in Margaret Sanger's magazine, Birth Control Review. Sanger's birth control argued eugenics didn't go far enough. Birth control distinguishes itself from eugenics by emphasizing the depopulation of the poor as a means for racial betterment. Sanger's Birth Control Review argued the Negro race was inferior. Negro women necessitated sterilization, and that the only solution to bettering the Negro race's stock required racial mixing with the white race. Sanger became an unprecedented missionary for the scientific eugenic philosophy across the world. Sanger's birth control movement required brick-and-mortar facilities with physicians specializing in forms of sterilization. January 8, 1918, Margaret Sanger achieved victory. New York State Court allowed physicians the powers to advise married couples to prevent a disease called pregnancy. Sanger understood Malthusian theory became more digestible in the form of birth control. This is the reason why the words birth control swept over the vast American continent from coast to coast, and birth control leagues were organized in all the great cities. After Sanger giving birth to birth control, all eugenics needed for progress was to trust the science.
When war broke out in 1914, total stalemate. Neither side could break through. One of Germany's leading scientists, Fritz Haber, offered the fatherland a way out of the impasse.
What can you think of? What can you contribute? You as a scientist, what's your contribution going to be?
Of Jewish origin, Dr. Haber was an internationally respected scientist. He'd already invented a process for extracting nitrates from the atmosphere. Still famous today, the Haber-Bosch process was used by Germany's vast chemical industry to manufacture fertilizers and later explosives. Without it, Germany could not have gone to war. In 1902, Haber had renounced his Judaism and become a Christian. Haber knew that each day the chemical industry produced tons of poison gas as a byproduct. In his laboratory, he searched for ways to apply these gases to the battlefield. He began to research an asphyxiating gas widely used in the dye industry, chlorine. He faced bitter opposition from an unexpected source. His wife, Clara, was also a chemist. She was convinced that science and war were morally incompatible, however noble the cause.
She had rendered her service, her oath on science, in 1900 as the first woman to get a PhD in chemistry. At that moment, she had sworn to use science only to the benevolence of mankind and not for the destruction of mankind.
At the end of 1914, Haber approached the military. He promised them chlorine gas would bring rapid victory. Germany was the only country that could produce it in the vast quantities required. Germany had signed the Hague Convention, banning the use of gas in war. Early in 1915, they decided to use Haber's new weapon. Assigned a military rank, Haber helped the High Command supervise the gas corps. At Ypres, on April the 22nd, 1915, they opened the valves, releasing a cloud of chlorine 5 feet high. It rolled gently towards the unsuspecting French and Algerian troops. There were 10,000 casualties. Terrified soldiers died where they fell as the cloud enveloped them. Everything in the cloud's path turned green. Bayonets, watches, even human skin.
The trend was set. There were other chemicals. There was biological weapons, radiological weapons, nuclear weapons. The whole progression of mass destruction was opened up on that day.
At the age of 40, Haber became a national hero. He was promoted to captain, the first scientist to be embraced by the military. Clara was mortified that her husband's scientific skill had been used to kill fellow humans.
Clara shot herself.
The next morning, Fritz went to the Eastern Front. He didn't care about the corpse of his wife at all. He went to the Eastern Front and he led the next gas war.
British scientists had been caught totally unprepared. They recommended the use of cloths moistened with urine. There was a rush to produce gas masks. The king himself took a personal interest. In May 1915, the cabinet gave the go-ahead for the development of gas. A special gas brigade was set up. The recruits included university professors. At Luz, on September the 25th, the British launched their first gas attack. It backfired badly. Halfway through, the wind changed and blew the gas back on the Allies. To try and improve their poison gas and rival the Germans, the government set up a chemical warfare establishment at Portendown. Gas was soon being used regularly by both sides. In 1916, 15,000 tons of chlorine were discharged.
They issue these gas masks which you carry with you all the time, and then they put you through a manoeuvre, put the gas mask on properly, then they put you through a hut full of gases on purpose. Once you've got past there, then you're enhanced in gas, and you wore your gas mask all the time.
In 1916, Harbour's laboratory trumped the Allies by producing a new, more noxious gas, phosgene, 18 times more powerful than chlorine. Victims drowned slowly in liquid produced by their own lung. But in autumn 1917, Germany's specialist gas divisions were summoned. The German gas brigade bombarded the Italians with phosgene. Totally unprotected, the Italian troops were quickly overcome. But on the Western Front, protection against chlorine and phosgene soon became so effective that another, more lethal gas was called for. Fritz Haber's institute set to work. His aim was to find a gas that would make gas masks useless by attacking the skin as well as the lung. He soon came up with a new horror, mustard gas. The vicious new gas assaulted the lungs and skin of its victims. Patches of skin affected erupted into massive yellow blisters. Haber's new weapon was used as soon as it was ready. In the first 3 weeks of its use, mustard gas killed or injured 14,000 Allied men. Birds in its path fell from trees. Rats and mice died in their thousands. Symptoms weren't always immediate. As well as ravaging the skin and lungs, it damaged the eyes and could cause blinding. As the war approached its climax, the Germans used mustard gas as a key weapon in their last campaign. 150,000 shells were fired at the Allies. By September 1918, the British had produced their own version. They unleashed mustard gas on the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry. An obscure corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler was among the victims needing medical treatment. He later wrote that it was the horror of being gassed that drove him out of the army and into politics. Thanks to gas masks and the vagaries of the wind, the world's first weapon of mass destruction hadn't decided the war, but it had killed over 100,000 men. Over 1 million had been poisoned by it and would bear its marks on their shattered lungs for years. Fritz Haber had feared he'd be tried as a war criminal. He did not have worried. In 1919, in honor of his pre-war work on nitrates, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. He continued his quest for new gas weapons, disguising it as research into pest control.
Fritz Haber knew the results of his pest control research could also be used for military purposes. After the war, his pest control institutes were used to camouflage military research institutes.
In the 1920s, Haber developed another toxic gas derived from hydrocyanic acid, a powerful insecticide in enclosed spaces that could also kill humans with great efficiency. Its name, Zyklon B. 20 years on, it would be used to commit mass murder in Nazi death camps.
The United States Public Health Service conducted a study beginning in 1932, which continues to this day, that involved deliberately withholding treatment from a group of 400 black men who were afflicted with syphilis. On September 8, 1968, Charlie Lee Pinkard, age 59, died suffering from syphilis and was buried in this rural cemetery in Macon County, Alabama. He was one of 400 black men who were so-called volunteers in the Tuskegee study.
In 1966, I was working for the U.S. Department of Public Health. One day, I was talking with some fellow workers. Somebody mentioned the Tuskegee study in the South. A black man who had gone into his private physician and been treated for syphilis, and later the private physician had been contacted that the man should not have been treated, that he was a voluntary participant in a human experiment on untreated syphilis.
These are some of the victims of syphilis. This is how it can disfigure. If untreated, syphilis can lead to massive heart disease, insanity, and eventually to death. In 1932, the U.S. Department of Public Health began a widespread syphilis treatment program in Macon County and in several other rural areas in the South. But in addition to treating thousands, the government decided to find out what would happen if the syphilis was allowed to develop uncontrolled by treatment for long periods of time. So they denied treatment to 400 black men in this experiment. Dr. Heller was directly involved in the study in 1933 and supervised it between 1943 and 1948.
As the best my memory serves me, which was 40 years ago, of course, the idea was to find a population with a heavy syphilis prevalence and incidence, and to study the course of syphilis in a population that was either untreated or relatively untreated. Tuskegee, Alabama, Macon County, that the incidence of syphilis was very high. As I recall it, something in the order of 50%. In early syphilis, it was treated with arsenic, bismuth, and mercury, all of which can be very, if not lethal, can be very dangerous to the individual if taken in too large doses. The treatment was not a good treatment overall, in the sense that you never knew whether the patient was sensitive to arsenic, for example. Bismuth and mercury were apt to have some deleterious effects on the patient, particularly if given in too large doses.
If the treatment was more dangerous than the disease, why was the government itself using that very treatment on thousands of clinic patients?
The infamous Tuskegee experiments were unethical before they selected a single participant. A doctor to purposely withhold treatment for anyone is a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. Scientists working for the United States Public Health Service continued to target minority groups disproportionately as the participants for unethical studies. Sanger's birth control review provides ample inspiration for selection of black and syphilitic subjects for this purpose. Why harm so many to arrive at an obvious conclusion? Patients perform better with treatment. Birth Control Review by Margaret Sanger, June 1932. A Negro number. The hearings on the birth control bills, introduced for the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control, were held before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Thursday, May 12th, and before the House Ways and Means Committee on Thursday, May 19th. Margaret Sanger, in her address to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee, said in part,
"The subject which this bill covers is usually referred to as birth control. This term originated in this country nearly 20 years ago. It means the conscious control of the birth rate by means that prevent the conception of life. In preventing conception, life is not destroyed. There is no interruption of life because life has not begun and therefore cannot be destroyed. By controlling the birth rate, it is not necessary to limit it. We control the furnace. We control traffic. We control our automobiles, which does not necessarily mean a ceasing of their functions. The idea of control is not new. Plato advocated it. Aristotle advocated it. Nature itself has been the most ruthless advocate of the control of population. The only difference is that the old method, advocated in the past, was the method of increasing the number of deaths through wars, pestilence, famine, while the modern method is to control the population by decreasing the number of births. We see the small groups who have controlled the size of their families, and we see a larger group who have not been able to avail themselves of any information whatever, while the other half are those generally classified as unfit mentally and physically, and include morons and mental defectives who usually come upon our social vista as permanent unemployables and dependents. In the first group, we have the educated, cultured, well-to-do citizens, professors, doctors, lawyers, ministers, scientists, artisans, and skilled laborers. Here we find the spacing of children and adopted rule, the mother's health being first considered, and the earning power of the father a close second. From this group come almost all our social movements. Civilization is directly benefited and advanced through this low birth rate group. In the other large family group, we have overcrowding, illiteracy, ignorance, slums, infant and maternal mortality, and child labor. Almost all our social problems are entrenched in this group, and these conditions and their problems are perpetuated from generation to generation. The Negro problem is one of the most complicated and most important confronting America. The present submerged condition of the Negro is due in large part to the high fertility of the race under disastrously adverse circumstances. The result has been a hopeless condition of poverty and degradation in perhaps far greater measure than in the case of the lower strata whites. Thus, the question arises, to what extent birth control has had a eugenic effect upon the Negro race? The social history of the Negro affords unique laboratory material in a study of this aspect of the birth control problem. Negro death rates are high. Infant and maternal mortality is disproportionately high, as is the incidence of illegitimacy, syphilis, and tuberculosis. President of the American Museum of Natural History commented on the immediate need of birth selection as a solution of the problems of overpopulation, unemployment, and poverty which confront every country of the world today. In a word, birth control demands the attention of those qualified to deal with it in a spirit of scientific impartiality. The time has come when the further development of the movement rests squarely upon the shoulders of the scientists and of the medical profession in particular.
An alle Erfinder, an die Männer der Wissenschaft, denkt nach, laboriert, experimentiert, gebt uns neue Anregungen, neue Erfindungen und neue Möglichkeiten. Und ihr habt Großes für Deutschland getan.
Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases, July 14th, 1933. Anyone who is suffering from a hereditary disease can be sterilized by a surgical operation if, according to the experiences of medical science, it is to be expected with great probability that his offspring will suffer from serious hereditary, physical, or mental defects. Those who suffer from any of the following diseases are considered to be suffering from a hereditary disease within the meaning of this law: mental deficiency from birth, schizophrenia, lunacy, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, physical malformation. Furthermore, persons suffering badly from alcoholism can be sterilized. The application is to be made to the office of the Eugenics Court. Competent to decide is the Eugenics Court, to whose sphere of jurisdiction the person to be sterilized normally belongs. The Eugenics Court is to be attached to a lower court. It consists of a lower court judge as a president, a civil service doctor, and another doctor approved for the German Reich, who is an expert on eugenics. The proceedings before the Eugenics Court are not public. The Eugenics Court must institute the necessary investigations. Legal and administrative authorities, as well as institutions for the care of the sick, have to give information to the Eugenics Court on demand. The surgical operation necessary for sterilization may only be carried out in an institute for the sick by a doctor approved by the German Reich. Once the court has finally decided on sterilization, it must be carried out even against the will of the person to be sterilized. The civil service doctor has to request the necessary measures from the police authorities. Where other measures are insufficient, direct force may be used. The Reich Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. The Human Betterment Foundation, February 12th, 1935. You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinion of the group of the intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epic-making program. Everywhere, I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought, and particularly by the work of the Human Betterment Foundation. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 50 million people.
Sterilization has been pushed really internationally as a way of population control. While population control is really a social policy that's instituted with the thought in mind that there are some people who should not have children or should have very few children, if any at all. What's wrong with sterilization and what has been wrong in the way it's been done in Puerto Rico is that very often women have not been informed.
A whole series of catastrophic images were created about the population in Puerto Rico, which made you think it was a place teeming with people climbing like ants on each other's back. At that time, there were about 654 people per square mile in Puerto Rico. Most of the people that left landed in Manhattan, where the population density was then about 90,000 per square mile. When people say that there's a surplus population someplace, you always have to ask, too many people for what? Too many people in particular with respect to how production is organized and how production is shared. So that from the beginning, the very earliest plan, it was very clear that a very intensive campaign promoting birth control, sterilization, and other forms of reducing birth were going to have to be put into place.
I was working in Puerto Rico in the medical school in those years, 1960 to 1970. One of the things that seemed pretty obvious to us then was that Puerto Rico was being used as a laboratory, and it was being used as a laboratory for the development of birth control technology.
Dr. Antonia Silva, as head of the family planning program in Puerto Rico, carried out plans for the sterilization of thousands of women. The hiring of Dr. Antonia Silva in the South Bronx is not accidental. We know that the government wants to rid the city of the poor and the minority people.
I worked in Lincoln Hospital for 8 years, and now sterilizations are markedly on the increase in the United States. And if we look at where they're on the increase, or on whom I should say they're on the increase, minority women and poor whites, especially in depressed areas where there is very high unemployment. Sterilizations are still being paid for by the government and are on the increase. It appears that sterilization as a solution to the so-called excess population in the United States is following the model set up in Puerto Rico.
September 12th, 1936. Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro by Drs. Vondelier, Clark, Wenger, and Heller. As the result of surveys of a few years ago in southern rural areas, it was learned that a considerable portion of the infected Negro population remained untreated during the entire course of syphilis. Such individuals seem to offer an unusual opportunity to study the untreated syphilitic patient from the beginning of the disease to the death of the infected person. An opportunity was also offered to compare this process, uninfluenced by modern treatment, with the results attained when treatment has been applied. Study of the untreated syphilitic and presumably non-syphilitic individuals under the age of 40 years indicates that syphilis in this period tends greatly to increase the frequency of manifestation of cardiovascular disease. Adequate treatment has not been freely available to most indigent citizens for a period longer than a decade. Adequate anti-syphilitic treatment prevented all forms of clinical relapse during the first 15 years of the infection, whereas only 1/4 of the Negroes with untreated syphilis were normal. Cardiovascular and central nervous system involvements were from 2 to 3 times as common in the untreated syphilis group as in a comparable group receiving even inadequate treatment. Dr. R.A. Vondelier. The average Negro is a most congenial person, and he has a tendency to agree with almost anything that one wishes him to agree with.
This is not the story of syphilis, the disease. It is the story of public health organization to stamp out syphilis. Private doctors are given free drugs to treat all their cases of syphilis. Systematic efforts have been made to find syphilis, bring it to treatment. Blood tests are a part of school health examination. Every child here has already been tested. In small communities in the outlying regions, the story is the same. Here at St. Simon's, 35 patients come to the clinic each week. Find syphilis. Bring it to treatment. That is the story of control. The treatment renders the patient non-infectious, stops the spread of the disease through the community. But many come to the clinic in this way, while many more come on foot, some walking 10 miles or more for treatment once a week for 70 weeks. Blood is taken for laboratory tests. Arsphenamine injected into the blood kills the germ of syphilis, and the patient can no longer transmit the disease to others. Behind a curtain in the rear of the trailer is a complete examination room. Here, bismuth is administered. Bismuth prevents the tragic relapses of heart and brain. This is the earliest possible diagnosis for syphilis. The earlier treatment is begun, the surer the cure. Trained laboratory technicians are essential. Laboratories can't afford to make mistakes. Negative, no syphilis. Positive reaction, note the heavy particles in the tube. That means syphilis. But there are 4 follow-up workers, 2 white and 2 color. The house-to-house canvass has proved also a most effective means of getting blood specimens. Midwives deliver 400 babies a year in these counties. Well trained by the health department, they are licensed by the state. Here they learn about the blood test in actual demonstration and bring mothers in for prenatal blood tests. Grocery man wraps up the clinic announcement with every purchase. Country store shares a place among its tobacco signs for clinic handbills. Wherever the workers go, they tell the story of the clinic to willing ears. How bad blood makes people sick, how it destroys heart and brain, how it makes babies die, how the blood test finds it, and how the treatment, if taken long enough, is certain cure. Blood specimens are taken in the turpentine wood, at factory gate, on the shrimp wharf, at the docks of the porgy fisherman. The man who has seen the blood test loses his fear. The man who hasn't had one wants it. Everyone talks about it. The blood test becomes a demonstration and a symbol. But the greatest help comes from the churches. Pastors are ever willing and glad to cooperate. They urge their people to join in the program. They tell them of the disease which threatens health and life and the generation yet unborn. They urge that the message will be carried forth to the countryside, that all may know and walk in the light of health. They themselves take the blood test as a demonstration and urge their parishioners to follow them. Such is the story of a community mobilized, a community which met syphilis with the weapons of medicine and modern public health.
In spite of the fact that a cure for syphilis has been known for 30 years, syphilis today is one of the most prevalent of serious diseases, a leading cause of sickness and death. There are 1 million new cases every year. Why, when physicians everywhere can diagnose and treat syphilis, do we permit this pale spiral germ to continue its devastation? The answer is ignorance. Ignorance is the greatest ally of syphilis. The disease develops insidiously. Years sometimes elapse before it makes itself known. A knowledge of the patient's history is the first step in diagnosis. There, the delicate and complicated test is applied. Only a physician can interpret the results of the test. When syphilis is found, treatment must begin at once. Early treatment is the patient's great hope of recovery. Cases discovered in the early stages can usually be made non-infectious and completely cured. Modern treatment usually consists of injections of some form of arsphenamine and bismuth. Treatments must be taken regularly and persistently. Injections over a period of a year or longer may be required for permanent results. The patient must also follow the doctor's orders as to food, proper rest, and particularly his precautions for protecting the health of others. The treatment of a single case may prevent the suffering, disability, and perhaps the death of no one knows how many others. Health agencies contribute by helping to trace infections and by teaching syphilis victims how to prevent the spread of infection. Many states now require that every expectant mother be examined and her blood tested for syphilis. An increasing number of states require that before marriage, both bride and groom have an examination, including a blood test for syphilis. Many industries are encouraging infected employees to secure treatment.
December 10th, 1939.
Dear Dr. Gamble, there is only one thing I would like to be in touch with, and that is the Negro Project of the South. I note that you doubt it worthwhile to employ a full-time Negro physician. It seems to me from my experience that while the colored Negroes have great respect for white doctors, they can get closer to their own members and more or less lay their cards on the table, which means their ignorance, superstitions, and doubts. They do not do this with the white people. And if we can train the Negro doctor at the clinic, he can go among them with enthusiasm and with knowledge, which I believe will have far-reaching results among the colored people. The minister's work is also important, and also he should be trained, perhaps by the Federation, as to our ideals and the goal that we hope to reach. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Sincerely yours, Margaret Sanger.
The idea of control of population is not new. The old method, advocated in the past, was through increasing the number of deaths through wars, pestilence, famine, while the modern method is to control the population by decreasing the number of births. The time has come when the further development of the movement rests squarely upon the shoulders of the scientists and medical profession. Hitler agreed. Science and the medical profession transitioned the eugenic concept of bad genes into bad blood, the problems that have been perpetuated from generation to generation. Margaret Sanger argued there was a problem, a Negro problem, of high fertility. This problem provided a unique opportunity to study what extent birth control had a eugenic effect on the Negro race. The same year as Sanger's statements, scientists at Tuskegee found an unusual opportunity in the infected syphilitic Negro population of the South. An immediate need of birth selection for the Negro race caused Margaret Sanger to arrive at her final solution. The ideals and goal that Sanger hoped to reach with birth control was an American Holocaust, with the stated purpose of exterminating the Negro race. An American Holocaust that inspired Hitler's Holocaust. Pastors, ministers, midwives, scientists, and medical professionals were ever willing to cooperate with abusing the authority of religion and science by making the blood test a demonstration and a symbol. A holy alliance formed science and religion in the mission of scientific eugenics, with the common purpose of straightening out anyone who understands this idea.
The X-ray technician consults the dosage specifications for the treatment. X-rays are produced when electrons traveling at high speed strike a metal target. The X-rays are given off from the target in all directions. A lead cone, or a lead plate with a hole in it, may be used to reduce the scattering of the rays. The patient is made as comfortable as possible and instructed that she must not move during treatment. Sandbags provide firm support. The doctor holds the tongue in position with gauze. The position of the cone is accurately checked by using a periscope. With it, the doctor can see if the malignant area lies in the path of the X-rays directly under the cone. Not until the lead-lined door is shut can the X-ray be turned on, for a safety switch is there to prevent accidental exposure to X-rays. X-rays scatter about a room by a process of reflection and penetrate ordinary walls. But by lining the treatment room with lead, the scattered rays are kept within it. The door and the windows, too, are lead-lined. In this way, X-rays are confined to the area of treatment. Because Mrs. Gordon's tongue has a growth of malignant tissue, high-voltage X-rays are being prescribed to achieve the desired therapeutic effect. These high-dosage X-rays have a lethal effect upon cells which gradually destroys them. However, normal cells are not killed as rapidly as the malignant cancer cells. X-rays, therefore, can be used to destroy cancer cells without permanently damaging surrounding normal cells, which can recover from the effects of the radiation. Mrs. Gordon's carcinoma responds well to a few weeks of treatment, but a hard core in the center of the tumor remains. That means a prescription for radon seed. A radon seed is a tiny gold capsule in which a gas called radon is sealed. The gas comes from radium and is radioactive, but a radon seed can be implanted inside the tissue. The nurse who administers radon seeds should use great care in handling them. Their radiations are very powerful. She handles them with long forceps behind a lead shield. They will be left permanently in the tongue. The radiation effect will continue for a period of weeks after treatment. With periodic medical checkups, Mrs. Gordon now may resume her former activities and live her normal life.
The lead lining scatters the X-rays by a process of reflection, confining the rays within the treatment room while protecting the doctor in the operation room. Doctors receiving any benefit at the cost of their patients is an example of the hypocritical oath. Radiation is as archaic of a cancer treatment as radon seeds. Will the radiation kill your cancer before it kills you? A game of Russian roulette by the World Death Organization.
Every year, diphtheria makes 60,000 of our children in Great Britain seriously ill. Every year, diphtheria kills 3,000 of our children. And yet, one thing could have stopped it all.
Inoculation. A long word for a simple thing, a safe thing, and a free thing.
It takes 3 months before inoculation becomes protection. So get it done at once.
Do it now.
This boy is not expected to live. He was not immunized. Every year, 3,000 children die like this from diphtheria.
This child need not have died. He could have been immunized and so protected against diphtheria.
Stop this needless death. Immunization does not hurt, does not make your child ill. You can get it done free. Make sure your child is done.
Every 15 minutes, a child is taken ill with diphtheria. Every 5 hours, a child dies from diphtheria. Last year, 51,163 people, mostly children, were attacked. Mother, do you realize what an unprotected child will suffer if diphtheria strikes? Mother, have you forgotten to protect your child?
1943 to 1973. Massachusetts Institute of Technology radiation experiments on mentally challenged children. In 1994, a task force was formed to report on the unethical radiation experiments performed by MIT from 1943 to 1973 on mentally retarded children within state-operated facilities in Massachusetts, the Fernald and Wrentham Institutions for Feeble-Minded Children. The MIT Science Club coerced its study participants by bribing retarded children with Boston Red Sox tickets, the beach, and eating outside. Even if the children didn't join the science club, they were assumed to be volunteering to participate within the study unless they mailed in their objections. The studies were presented as an attempt to uncover the origins of Mongolism, which was the term for retardation at the time. The parents were told the injections of radioactive iodide were safe and approved by MIT, and it would only cost the parents $10 per test. The studies were sponsored by Quaker Oats. The purpose was to scientifically determine whether Quaker Oats was more nutritious than cream of wheat. The iron study in 1946, sponsored by Quaker Oats, gave subjects radioactive milk. Calcium studies in the 50s, also supported by Quaker Oats, involved injecting radioactive calcium isotope 45 into children, all weighing under 100 pounds, including a 10-year-old subject who died during the study. Other studies had extremely troubling amounts of radiation used, or documents were destroyed to hide the evidence. A scientific endeavor harming the vulnerable with no positive benefits to mankind. Welcome to the club, the Science Club, brought to you by MIT, Quaker Oats, and Eugenics.
E is equal mc square, in which energy is per equal to mass multiplied with the square of the velocity of light, showed that very small amount of mass may be converted into a very large amount of energy.
Albert Einstein pleads to the United States. He leads a vanguard of refugee scientists, virtually stripping German universities of their best minds. One teacher compares Einstein's migration to the possible transfer of Vatican City from Rome to the New World. The Pope of Physics has moved, he says, and the United States will now become the center of the natural sciences. By the summer of 1942, control of the atom bomb project passes to the hands of the Army under the code name Manhattan Engineering District. Engineer Chief General Eugene Rybold gives command of the Manhattan Project to Brigadier General Leslie Groves, the man who built the Pentagon. Newspapermen receive a list of words banned for the duration. To avoid arousing suspicion, the key phrases uranium fission and atomic energy are spotted among fictitious names like yttrium. Science editors cannot write about atomic physics. Even the comic strip Flash Gordon is censored. The word atom disappears from the vocabulary of America. American colleges are now raided for manpower. Students are snatched from the campus and drafted into the Manhattan Project. Nerve centers are chosen for producing an atom bomb. Pasco, Washington. Here, a giant industrial complex will blossom. Wendover Field, Utah, will become a special Air Force training base. But it is in a secluded valley near Clinton, Tennessee. Here at Oak Ridge, the largest manufacturing plant ever conceived begins to rise. It must produce 100 pounds of uranium-235 in July 1945. The first test is scheduled for an atom bomb. In Truman's own words, I did not like the weapon, but I had no qualms if in the long run millions of lives could be saved. The Enola Gay arrives. In 10 seconds, the world will shake. Had produced the birth of the atomic age. A force for good or evil, the choice belongs to man.
Spoiler alert. The World Death Organization chose evil.
In the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean lies the tiny coral atoll of Bikini. The power of a single bomb was not too well known because there had been but 3 exploded, none at sea. Everything from canned milk to tanks be subjected to the blast. Different animals have been placed aboard the ships to substitute for military personnel. Some were shaved in order that the effects of heat and radiation on their skin could be observed and the results applied to the design of protective clothing. Meanwhile, on board the carriers at sea, automatic cameras are being installed in the Navy's radio-controlled drones. Bomb away!
There it goes. The 4th atomic bomb has been successfully detonated. In less than a minute, it has reached a point 1 mile above the Earth. Although a beautiful sight, this swirling, boiling mushroom cloud is certain death to any living thing which approaches too close to its edge. Radioactive fission particles are dispersed throughout the cloud, and the deadly radiation from these particles must be avoided until the cloud is thoroughly diffused in the upper atmosphere. Under the guidance of the Manhattan Projects, Army Air Forces installed specially designed filters on 4 of their B-17 pilotless drone planes so that an airplane could go into the very center of the cloud and bring back samples of the radioactive particles without danger to a human pilot.
These animals survived the blast, but died later from the effect of radioactivity. The primary purpose of Test Baker was to secure precise ship damage and instrumentation measurements resulting from an atomic bomb explosion just under the surface of the water. Fire! Great quantities of radioactive water from the column descended upon the decks of the nearby vessels, and ship hulls a mile away were drenched by the wall of foaming water. Here is an Army Air Force drone approaching the cloud column. The water and spray from the explosion will fall for several minutes. This highly lethal spray was intensely radioactive, partly by reason of the neutron bombardment of the sodium in the salt contained in seawater. Despite the presence of radioactive contamination, radiological safety patrols immediately entered the lagoon for a preliminary appraisal of the damage.
Japan and China's history of bioweapon attacks on each other escalated to its peak during World War II. After visiting Germany to study World War I chemical weapons, soldier scientist Shiro Ishii conceived Unit 731, a biological and chemical weapons division with the ultimate purpose of germ warfare. A chemical research facility was built in Pingfang in 1938, constructed by Suzuki. At Pingfang, prisoners' life expectancy was under a month, and there were no survivors of Unit 731. Researching which diseases were optimal for military use, Ishii developed a bubonic plague bomb in 1944. Ishii's bomb consisted of a porcelain container filled with 30,000 plague-carrying fleas, carried by a parachute that detonated at the most lethal altitude. Experiments on live Chinese, Soviet, and American prisoners of war proved 80% of the fleas survived explosion. Eggs were used as the medium to breed viruses such as plague and were used as bioweapons. The Japanese awarded Ishii for attacking the Chinese with plague. After the war, General MacArthur promised immunity to the members of Unit 731. At Fort Detrick, Ishii suggested his experience would benefit the United States in the event of war with the Soviet Union. The American leadership in Unit 731 bonded on their mutual treatment of people as lab rats. Ishii was rewarded with a senior advisor position to the U.S. Army on bioweapons. U.S. Army Unit 406 was established in Tokyo to research viruses. You may see a war criminal in Shiro Ishii, but the U.S. Army saw Ishii's value. Commit genocide, and you too can be awarded, rewarded, and granted immunity by the World Death Organization.
The medical experiments were conducted in Guatemala more than 6 decades ago, but did not come to public light until this past weekend. Between 1946 and 1948, researchers with the U.S. Public Health Service deliberately infected nearly 700 Guatemalans with syphilis, in most cases without their knowledge, in an effort to determine whether penicillin could prevent the disease.
They were trying to figure out whether penicillin would work for syphilis, but they needed a pool of infection. So they went to Guatemala because prostitution was legal in Guatemala, and it was also legal to take a prostitute into a prison for sexual services for prisoners. Right, they started off doing prisoners, and when not enough infection was created with the prostitutes, they moved on to actually giving the men syphilis itself. Because they needed a larger pool of subjects, they moved on to an army barracks and then to National Insane Asylum.
With the possibility of a serious infantile paralysis epidemic, health authorities of the city of San Antonio, Texas, attacked the germ carriers throughout the city. With the war discovered DDT in special sprayers, sections of the city are blanketed with the insecticide. Children are forbidden to gather. Again, war has contributed one of its discoveries to save life.
It begins with the war-borne development of DDT. DDT is absorbed through the feet and spreads throughout the insect's entire nervous system. The effect is disastrous. DDT seems to literally drive bugs crazy. Its DDT content is even higher than government specifications. And once applied, it keeps right on killing them.
It's compounded with a new type of synthetic resin which binds DDT to any surface. On screens, where it not only kills insects, but also tends to keep the screen wire from rusting. Same deadly effectiveness of the liquid form is found in the Pestroy powder, another constant threat to insect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a handful of concentrated death, and it's perfect for ridding Fido of those unwelcome house guests. It's also good for use on swamps and pools of stagnant water, campsites, and wherever else bugs like to breed and gather. Additional DDT crystals continue to form at the surface as time goes on.
There must be a catch to it. Maybe Pestroy hurts humans, too.
No, sir. It harms only us, the citizens of Bugdom.
The Africans at first were not very impressed. Some are afraid that the DDT will poison them, while others suspect some sort of witchcraft. He says that the new medicine is a bad poison that may exterminate the whole tribe.
Mrs. Margaret Slee, president of America's Planned Parenthood Federation, maintains that European women should stop having babies for the next 10 years.
Don't you think such a theory, such a radical theory, is antisocial?
On the contrary, it seems to me that it is more practical and humane.
What about the women who want babies now and in 10 years will not be able to have babies? Rather impractical, don't you think?
Oh, John, you do ask hard questions. I should think that instead of being impractical, it is really very practical and intelligent and humane.
But Mrs. Slee, in this country, having babies is the only thing left which is both unrationed and untaxed. Do you think we really ought to stop?
Well, I suppose a subject like that is really so personal that it's entirely up to the parents to decide. But from my view, I believe that there should be no more babies.
July 30th, 1948, the Nuremberg trials. United States of America versus Carl Crouch et al., the I.G. Farben trial. Although the original Nuremberg trial concluded October 1st, 1946, there were 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials held by military tribunal between December 1946 and April 1949. The Carl Crouch trials were for key Nazi doctors and members of I.G. Farben, the pharmaceutical conglomerate who had more ties to the Nazi Party and Hitler than any individual company. The trial did not include many significant Nazi doctors. Carl Crouch wasn't even the most prominent Nazi doctor named Karl. Karl Klauberg ran a Nazi hospital called Block 10 in Auschwitz, specifically for the sterilization of Jewish women. At the suggestion of Heinrich Himmler, Klauberg sought to create the cheapest, most efficient form of mass permanent sterilization in history. Klauberg achieved this goal by injecting formalin, 37% formaldehyde by weight, into the cervix, causing obstruction of the fallopian tubes. Karl Klauberg's sterilization device technique and his other discoveries are still used today. Progenon and Prolutin remain lucrative pharmaceutical products. Hormonal preparations used for transitioning transgender individuals to this day. Klauberg also discovered a natural substance for permanent sterilization, a plant called Caladium seguinum, used as homeopathic medicine for itchy genitals. The modern form of I.G. Farben is Bayer, and they continue to profit from Karl Klauberg's permanent sterilization technique derived from Nazi human experiments. Essure, a permanent sterilization coil, utilizes Klauberg's technique by placing a metal coil into the cervix, causing obstruction of the fallopian tubes. Another Nazi doctor, Karl Bosch, chaired I.G. Farben from 1935. Fritz Haber was a member of I.G. Farben's board since its founding in 1925.
He'd already invented a process for extracting nitrates from the atmosphere, still famous today. The Haber-Bosch process was used by Germany's vast chemical industry.
I.G. Farben not only made pharmaceutical products like aspirin, but pioneered the processes for chemical production in many industries. I.G. Farben provided funding for the Nazi Party and Hitler's rise, and in return, I.G. Farben had intimate control of concentration camp construction in Auschwitz. Otto Ambros, head of I.G. Farben's Chemical Weapons Division, chose the Auschwitz concentration campsite due to the logistics of transporting slave labor to the I.G. Farben Auschwitz factory. I.G. Farben took advantage of the available slave labor in Auschwitz as participants in their human experiments for the purpose of developing pharmaceutical products. IG Farben tested a new method of typhus vaccine manufacturing by breeding typhus in chicken eggs. The previous typhus vaccine, ground-up lice intestines combined with phenol, could only be produced by a skilled technician at the rate of 10 vaccines a day. The new chicken egg method yielded 15,000 vaccines a day from unskilled technicians. Because this method was unsafe, this was a perfect opportunity to produce otherwise unattainable data for IG Farben's pharmaceutical research and development. Otto Ambrose, guilty of slave labor, was sentenced to 8 years in prison but got out early on good behavior. 4 years after release from prison, Ambrose would advise Kemi Grunenthal into the largest medical disaster at the time with thalidomide, a drug derived from Nazi experiments. Ambrose advised Dow Chemical and the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. The U.S. Army arrested Ambrose in 1946, then hired him to help develop Agent Orange, Blue, Pink, and the rest of the pesticide-laden rainbow. In a shocking coincidence, Dow Chemical was one of the companies who received the contract for Agent Orange production. Even Ronald Reagan admitted he had no knowledge of what Ambrose did specifically for the Army. Fritz Dermier, guilty of mass murder and enslavement, was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but also got out early on good behavior. Dermier would chair Bayer for nearly 10 years. Not a single defendant at the IG Farben trials would get more than 8 years, and none of them served the full length of their sentence. They received light punishment for cooperation with the Operation Paperclip program, which would recruit over 1,000 Nazi scientists to work for the U.S. government. The trial neglected to mention the deadliest Nazi experiment due to the lucrative IG Farben product it revolved around, phenol. Phenol can be converted inexpensively to precursors for plastics and is vital for production of herbicides, aspirin, hair dye, sunscreen, and cosmetics. Phenol is banned from cosmetic products in Europe and Canada for safety reasons. The Nazi phenol experiments achieved their goal of finding an inexpensive extermination solution in smaller capacity situations where gassing became uneconomical. The phenol experiments were the result of various Nazi vaccine experiments that would create epidemics within the camps. Jews suspected of spreading epidemics would be exterminated individually with phenol injections. The hospital where the phenol was administered by Nazi doctors killed 20,000 people in a 2-year period. The lasting legacy of the unethical Nazi human experiments are the vaccine and phenol experiments leading to vaccine technological advancements based on flawed, unethical data. Formalin and phenol were used to permanently sterilize and exterminate Jews inexpensively and efficiently during the Holocaust. Modern mass vaccine production techniques derive from Nazi experiment data. H.R. Cox could not produce vaccines safely and effectively from chicken eggs, and the medical community agreed. Jonas Salk created the first formalin inactivated vaccine, the flu vaccine, in 1941. But Jonas Salk could have not created his formalin inactivated polio vaccine without the medical community utilizing the Nazi experiment data on chicken egg vaccine production. The data was unethical, but just as importantly, did not show efficacy and safety, yet this data was used as the foundation for many modern medicines, primarily vaccines. All modern vaccines derive from Nazi experiment data. Hail Salk, hail science, hail vaccines.
Today, the peoples of the world are one people, joined by wings over the globe. Today, vital medical control is established around the modern points of international exchange. How long does it take before a potential epidemic can be detected from one continent to another? Passengers in a modern plane look perfectly healthy. But how do we know? That little girl, when she got the doll, did she receive germs as well? Some passengers may be germ carriers, perhaps already in the incubation stage. They'll reach their destination before any symptoms show. The quarantine service can't keep every plane and passenger grounded for several days to effect thorough medical control. Today, that system of defense is no longer enough. Today, epidemics must be crushed at the very source.
The contributions of progress to scientific eugenics by the military-industrial complex and Planned Parenthood are undeniable, but there is one group that had a more global impact upon the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, formed in 1948 by the United Nations to control epidemics by promoting mass vaccination programs worldwide. The inaugural World Health Organization bulletin featured 4 separate reports on vaccinal encephalitis, vaccine-induced swelling of the brain, No vaccine distinguished themselves from this fate. All vaccines in all countries were proven to cause encephalitis, corroborated by the WHO and scientific community. Outbreaks of vaccinal encephalitis in Sweden and Netherlands temporarily ceased their mandatory vaccination programs. Vaccinal encephalitis rates as low as 1 to 641 were reported. The WHO acknowledged animal DNA containing viruses could complicate the interaction with the vaccinated virus, contaminating all vaccines. To protect from the chance of getting a virus, the WHO argues for mandating the injection of that virus, contaminated with foreign viruses, into every child. If you're injured from a vaccine, the WHO suggests a blood transfusion only from someone recently vaccinated, stoking fear for justification, enabling hypochondriacs at the benefit of pharmaceutical contributors, and perpetually providing solutions worse than the original problem. The eternal fight of the World Health Organization since 1948.
Dr. Guy's ambition was to rid the world of cancer. He was convinced that the secret of how to do this lay inside the human cell. For 20 years he had been trying to grow human cells in test tubes, but every attempt failed. After a few days the cells always died. Henrietta Lacks was taken to Baltimore's main hospital.
I just happened to be the one who saw her when she first came in. On the examination of the cervix by the eye, I was extremely impressed, and I can see that lesion today. This was different. This didn't look like cancer. It was purple, and it bled very easily on touching. I'd never seen anything look like it. It was a very special, different kind of what turned out to be a tumor.
As usual, a small piece of the cancerous tissue was cut off and taken to Dr. Guy. Henrietta Lacks's cells began to do what Guy had dreamed of. They started to grow in his laboratory. This is the film he took of their first week's growth. These are Henrietta Lacks's cells, filmed 6 weeks later. Each cell is now dividing every 20 hours. For any cancer, it was a record growth rate.
The cells exhibited the same growth in the test tube as they exhibited in her, so it was the first human cell line. Her tumor, incidentally, did not respond well to treatment.
Henrietta Lacks died on October the 4th, 1951. That same evening, Dr. Guy appeared on a television science program to show off his breakthrough.
Now let me show you a bottle in which we have grown massive quantities of cancer cells.
As he held Henrietta Lacks's cells up to the camera, his assistant was in the autopsy room. Dr. Guy had sent her to get more of the precious cells from the dead body.
And I was all alone with my petri dish, and I walked in and she was all completely open. You could look in and see tumor everywhere on all the tissues, and her bladder was one complete solid mass of tumor.
Dr. Guy kept what he had done a secret from her family. He was worried they might sue him. He gave the cells a codename, Lila, told everyone they came from a woman called Helen Lane. Henrietta Lacks was forgotten by science, but her cells were about to become world famous. For the first time, anything could be tested on living human cells. Her cells were sent into space, accompanied by 2 white mice. Cosmetic companies bought millions of her cells to test for possible side effects in their new products. The American military placed large flasks of HeLa cells next to atomic tests. They wanted to see what the effects of radiation would be on human tissue. And then came polio. HeLa cells were the perfect host on which to grow and study the polio virus. From this came the development of the vaccine that conquered the disease. 2 scientists went to a maximum security prison in Ohio. They took with them large quantities of Henrietta Lacks's cells.
They were inoculating them with HeLa cells under the skin to see if the HeLa cells would grow and cause a cancer.
Now, why did you volunteer for this?
My grandmother, my father both died of cancer.
Some of the prisoners developed small tumors.
A virus that causes polio has been successfully grown inside chicken eggs. This may lead to the development of a potent vaccine to prevent the dreaded disease, one that could be produced on a large scale at low cost. The vaccine, successful on monkeys, has not been tested on humans.
Whose name was Jonas Salk. He took poliovirus, he grew it in cells in the laboratory, and then he purified the virus and killed it with formaldehyde. And what he found was that if he took this formaldehyde inactivated virus, injected it into the arms of children, he could induce an immune response. And the way that he proved that was big clinical trial, giving 3 doses of vaccine to 420,000 children. At the time, that vaccine for this trial was made by 2 companies, Eli Lilly and Park Davis. The announcement that this vaccine worked was made on April the 12th, 1955. 2:15 that afternoon, that vaccine was submitted for licensure to the National Institutes of Health. And at 5 o'clock, it was licensed. So it took about 2 hours and 45 minutes. Department of Health Education and Welfare was angry that it took that long. Because it took so long, 2 hours and 45 minutes, that really went beyond the time in which it was going to be on the news that night. There were 5 companies actually that received the license. Wyeth, Pittman Moore, and Cutter also made vaccine which was licensed and released at that time, even though those vaccines had never been tested in clinical trials. The 5 companies that made vaccine, the quantities of vaccine that they made and distributed April 12, 1955. 2 weeks later, this headline appeared in the New York Times. One firm's vaccine barred, 6 polio cases are studied. All 6 children were paralyzed in their arms. Also, all 6 cases involved paralysis in the arm that was injected. And the vaccine that they were injected in all 6 cases was vaccine made by Cutter Laboratories, a pharmaceutical company in Berkeley, California. They withdrew Cutter's vaccine from the market, and frankly, about 2 weeks later, withdrew all polio vaccine for the market. The federal government could figure out what was going on. 2 of those lots were associated with a very high instance of paralysis. Every dose, those 2 high-risk lots contained natural, virulent, dangerous virus that hadn't been adequately inactivated with formaldehyde. About 120,000 children were inoculated inadvertently with live polio virus. Those children actually started a small man-made polio epidemic, and 100,000 of their family or community contacts were also infected. 70,000 people developed abortive polio caused by polio virus that was made by Cutter in their laboratories. 164 people were permanently paralyzed, and about 10 were killed. It was probably one of the worst biological disasters in the history of the United States. Polio virus was getting caught up in its dead cells or cell debris, and formaldehyde wasn't adequately able to reach those virus particles, and as a result, not able to kill them. All 5 companies had pools of virus, in theory, that should have been free of live virus, that still contained live virus. What the companies would do, they would reinactivate them with formaldehyde, but clearly the process of scaling up was a difficult one. And you can see with Cutter, there were 35 cases that were observed with only 5 expected. Clearly there was a problem with Cutter's vaccine, but also, if you look at Wyeth's vaccine, you can see that there were 11 cases.
Preparation of a non-infectious vaccine has suddenly assumed far more importance than we would have liked. When exposed to formalin, the decline of virus activity could be measured down to this point, which is approximately 3 days. Now, theoretically, it is perfectly reasonable to make a projection below the line and say that after a certain additional period of time, any additional virus particles that are present will be destroyed at approximately the same rate. This is the principle upon which the vaccine that was made for the field trial and, of course, for our earlier studies was based, to satisfy us that virus inactivation was occurring at the proper rate. Theoretically, one should not, if all has gone well, all of the proper precautions had been taken, one should not be able to detect virus in vaccine samples. Now, if in the sampling or the testing, at any point beyond that which was theoretically calculated, live virus was still detectable, that, of course, would be unsatisfactory and would indicate that something had gone wrong in the processing. Now, that would be the red light to indicate that not only was there something wrong in this batch, but if this is the sort of thing that happened frequently and repeatedly, then there must be something wrong someplace along the assembly line. This type of concept had not been utilized in the preparation of vaccine, but for that matter, vaccines for other diseases did not possess the same potential hazard as does a vaccine for poliomyelitis, and it is well known now that in those areas that are so-called underprivileged, we find a high proportion of individuals who have antibody at an early age, and in the more highly privileged or better hygiene areas with better hygienic conditions, there are fewer individuals with antibody. Shows that individuals who have some prior antibody level from a prior natural infection do respond much more remarkably.
Is there a danger of viruses that monkeys may have getting into the vaccine? I think Dr. Salk.
The danger is not their getting into the vaccine, but their being there to begin with, in the sense that monkeys undoubtedly harbor a number of viruses just as do man. Many animals harbor viruses that heretofore were not known, just as there are non-pathogenic bacteria or latent bacteria that may someday become pathogenic. Wherever viruses have emerged in the course of cultivating monkey tissues, we have studied the effect of formaldehyde on these viruses, and we have found uniformly that these viruses are all destroyed much more rapidly than is poliomyelitis virus. And one of the extraordinary things about the polio virus is that it seems to be much more resistant to chemical action than do other viruses. If viruses might conceivably be present in the raw material, the method of treatment at the moment seems to take care of it. This is usually done in laboratories where the trypsinized kidney cells are used, because the cells have to grow out for a period of time. The raw material that is used before before formaldehyde is even added, is tested for the presence of B virus, which is the only virus of monkeys that are known to be pathogenic for man.
Dr. Goldberg of New York, in reference to an alleged report that you, Dr. Ripper, spoke of on the CBS, wherein you stated that intramuscular injections, even if only of water, might predispose a patient with incipient polio to polio. 440,000 people were given the vaccine, and 1,400,000 were in the control subject. Of the number of people in the vaccinated group who came down with polio, and of the number of people in the control group who came down with polio, I divided the figure, and I came out with 1 out of every 3,100 in the unvaccinated group, and 1 out of every 6,200 in the vaccinated group. Now, to me, this seemed that the polio vaccine, instead of having a potential 80 to 90% validity, has only a 50-50 chance validity. Now, are my statistics wrong?
No, your arithmetic is good.
The great concern that we have is that because of improved hygienic conditions, the transport of virus in the community has been reduced and will be reduced far more effectively by those means, which will occur more rapidly and more effectively than will immunization.
The Cutter incident, the failure of the initial polio vaccine rollout, forced a humiliated Jonas Salk to finally answer the basic criticisms of his unfounded vaccine theories. Jonas Salk's theory of formaldehyde inactivation undeniably failed the scientific method. Inconsistent results between manufacturers proved Salk's theory could not be replicated in multiple labs, therefore making it a baseless theory. The vaccine manufacturers became the scapegoat for Salk's failure, and the scapegoats threw Cutter under the bus. All vaccine companies manufacturing Salk's polio vaccine had inconsistent inactivation, and Eli Lilly exhibited comparable amounts of paralysis as Cutter. Federal regulators also failed by putting blind faith in an inactivation concept only reviewed for a few hours before approving licenses. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine technology was flawed on every level. Cancerous untested HeLa cells propagated polio. The vaccine was contaminated with various animal DNA, mostly from monkey testicles and kidneys. And ultimately, vaccinated immunity never competed with natural immunity, or even proper hygiene. Salk's polio vaccine even leaked, creating super spreaders of the experimentally injected. The unnecessary double-blind design of the trials deliberately obfuscated the placebo and vaccinated groups to the point of being indistinguishable. Statistically, 59% of the polio vaccine trial was deemed worthless, and 41% of the trial biased towards the vaccinated. Even with manipulating the control group by stacking the deck with the highest polio incidence counties, the vaccinated group showed only 50% efficacy, a failing grade by any measure of vaccine efficacy. The vaccine leaking alone would confound the data to the point of making the data irrelevant. Reports showed intramuscular injections of water could predispose a patient with incipient polio to develop into polio. The failure of the virus inactivation and the vaccine leaking led to the polio vaccine causing more polio than it prevented, leaving Jonas Salk and vaccine apologists to make a meager correlation equals causation analysis of reduced polio numbers. As Jonas Salk said multiple times, the reduction of polio was not from vaccinal immunity, but natural immunity and improved hygienic conditions. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was proven to be completely ineffective and dangerously unsafe. Monkey DNA contamination proved to be the issue that was predicted by the polio vaccine critics. In 1960, simian virus 40, one of 54 separate simian viruses, contaminated approximately 30% of all polio vaccines, but Salk's was the largest culprit. An unsuccessful attempt to protect us from a virus that killed thousands ended in 10 to 30 million people worldwide receiving a cancer-causing monkey virus. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine is the example of why you don't trust the science. You test the science. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. There are failures, abject failures. And then there is the largest failure in the history of science, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine.
My guests' opinions are not necessarily mine. The stations are my sponsors, Philip Morris Incorporated, but whether you agree or disagree, we feel that none should deny the right of these views to be broadcast. When Mrs. Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States back in 1916, birth control was a dirty word. The police threw her into jail as they were to do 7 more times during her crusade. That crusade kept Mrs. Sanger away from her children for long periods. It helped to break up her first marriage.
I came with a large family. My mother died young, 11 children, made an impression on me as a child. I was a trained nurse.
Your mother, as you say, died prematurely after bearing 11 children. She was born a Catholic, was she not?
She was born a Catholic, yes.
Your father was a sort of village atheist who clashed with church authorities, and because of his atheism, his earnings dwindled under community pressure. You and your brothers and sisters were known as, quote, children of the devil, end quote. Could it be that you were driven emotionally toward the birth control movement because of antagonism toward the church, because that was a way to fight the church?
No, I don't think I had anything of the kind in mind. I don't like to see people suffer. I don't like to see cruelty, even to this day. And in nursing, you see a great deal of cruelty and unnecessary suffering.
You have helped to spread the birth control movement not only here in the United States, but in Europe and the Orient as well. Why? Why is birth control of such vital importance internationally? Is it just to save women suffering? Is that the only reason in your mind?
Well, not entirely. The population question is a great concern today. I went to every country because I was invited.
Well, do you believe that birth control is essential if we want to keep millions of people across the world from starving? Is that your thesis?
Well, I think that birth control, if you keep your population more or less static until you pick up your resources, prevent their starving.
Well, what's more important, birth control or picking up the resources?
Picking up the resources, there's just a limit to that, too.
According to the tenets of Catholicism, they rule that birth control violates not only the church's position, it isn't the church's position, but they say that it violates a natural law.
And how do they know? And yet they speak to people as if they were God.
Philadelphia Daily News on June 10, 1942. The story quotes you as urging the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to give its members, quote, preventive measures against pregnancy, end quote. And you add, quote, abortion and illegitimacy are bound to result if the government doesn't recognize human nature, end quote. In other words, you were not advocating Christian morality, but rather ways for single women to avoid bearing illegitimate children. You said earlier this week, it's not only wrong, it should be made illegal for any religious group to prohibit dissemination of birth control, even among its own members. In other words, you would like to see the government legislate religious beliefs in a certain sense.
Well, I have a different attitude about the divine. I feel that we have divinity within us.
One final question. You have 2 sons. How many children have they?
Would you like to see them?
I would indeed.
5 boys and a girl in that family.
And in the other family?
2 girls.
Leopoldville engages in an all-out fight against infantile paralysis, crowding every clinic with mothers and their children. The latter to receive orally administered shots of a new vaccine against the scourge of childhood. It is a live virus preparation developed in the United States by Philadelphia's Dr. Hilary Koprowski. And it differs from our famed Salk vaccine in that it does away with injections. And it must taste good if the children's receptivity to it is a criterion.
The Princess Astrid Institute is one of the most important and complete labs in Central Africa. It has as its disposal a large staff and high-tech equipment for standard analysis, scientific research, and vaccine production for fighting infectious diseases. Official authorities are especially concerned with children, the very future of our country. All school children get a medical examination and are given a health book, a true health identity card. The efficient organization of medical records in the Belgian-controlled Congo made the population extremely suitable for experimentation.
How long is it, Dr. Sabin, since your live virus vaccine really was developed?
Actually, the developmental work on it began almost 25 years ago.
How long since it was shown positively to be safe and effective?
It took the tremendous field trials on a worldwide basis, very different conditions and involving millions of children. And since the beginning, actually, of January of 1960, more than 85 million persons all over the world have received the vaccine, not counting those in the United States.
Isn't it a fact that many youngsters, maybe thousands each year, are contracting paralytic polio in the United States who might be protected?
Well, I'd have to answer, of course, yes. There are still many thousands getting it each year in this country, Canada, and many other parts of the world.
It's been said recently, and more or less in connection with the Salk vaccine, that the polio problem has been solved.
Even now, among the reported cases of paralytic polio, 23 to 25% of the children who get polio have had 3 or more doses of Salk vaccine. Also, large numbers, for one reason or another, social, economic, and other reasons, are not getting the vaccine.
What got you started on the notion of a live virus vaccine?
The discoveries in the early 50s provided us with tools of being able to grow the polio viruses and cultures of tissue outside the body.
I suppose you tried these viruses, these strains on animals for quite a number of years before you fed anything to a human being.
Well, of course, that is quite true. The largest part of the $1.5 million that I told you about was spent on monkeys and chimpanzees. We must have used many more than 10,000 monkeys and hundreds of chimpanzees in this work before it was ever fed to the first human being.
Gee, that does sound like a lot of monkeys.
I sometimes have bad dreams about that, in which I am in a court of monkeys, you see, and they are judging me, whether or not I had a right to do what I did.
So the important field tests were on people.
And these are the young men in the Federal Reformatory in Chillicothe, Ohio, who were in effect in quarantine, and for several years everything was tested out on these volunteers at the Federal Reformatory, and that provided us with the basic information before we could go on with the final tests on the vaccine that was selected. The largest trials were done to begin with, and almost entirely in foreign countries rather than in the United States. Well, I think an incentive is important in everything, and I think pharmaceutical companies are entitled to incentive. I think that some responsible agency like the U.S. Public Health Service ask the companies to make much more vaccine than the United States itself can use. And when they do that, they'll be able to make it very much cheaper. They will have the incentive by some sort of promise. They should have a promise, either by contract or subsidy, that what they make will be bought. By making it in large quantities, the states and cities and the people themselves will be able to get it at this very low, cheap price. There are more than 1.5 billion people in different parts of the world who need this vaccine and cannot afford to have it.
Our spraying in this dilution will not harm fish, but we recommend that you cover your pools if you can. They sprayed 1,200 square miles of country, including salt marshes and dairy farms and open plains, because payment was made not by the square mile or the acre, but by the gallon. There's no question that the most annoying mosquito on the entire Atlantic seaboard is virtually immune to DDT. New York City spent $250,000 in spraying, which the entomologists tell us probably didn't kill a mosquito. And the arrogance of these men to say there was DDT in Long Island milk, but I quote now, not enough to hurt you. Now, who are they to say that when the tolerance in milk of DDT is 0, as ordered by the United States Health and Welfare Service? We know what has happened in New Brunswick rivers when some miserable campaign against spruce budworm caused the death of 15 million salmon. Same thing in the rivers of the Yellowstone system, killed nearly all the fish in the rivers, and the budworm is there. But now we have hundreds of centers of infection instead of the 37 we had then. We want no more of that.
The virus is grown first in one tissue culture, then in another. Human kidney tissue, human amnion, egg amnion, chick embryo. It is transferred, it is incubated. The less developed countries in Africa watch this progress with great interest. Helping them launch studies of the vaccine are first the U.S. Armed Forces Epidemiological Board, and later the World Health Organization and U.S. Public Health Service. The vaccine is contributed by Merck, Sharp, and Dohme. The drum speaks to the people. Come to the village. The doctors are here with the medicine. It can protect your children. And the people do come, bringing their children, bringing their hopes and fears. Then begins the long, hard job of giving the life-saving vaccine to the children. As soon as one village has been protected, the team must move on to the next. Everywhere they are greeted by huge crowds. The lines seem endless, but all the children must get the vaccine. Village after village, the people come by the thousands. The team works around the clock. By March 1963, 700,000 children in Upper Volta received live virus measles vaccine. Within 48 hours of official government licensing, supplies of the vaccine are ready for shipment to doctors throughout the country.
Because of the fantastic growth rate in California, birth control is one of this state's most urgent problems. Now the state legislature wants birth control information made available to the public. It remains for the 18 million people now in California to accept or reject this new effort to control population.
And I think one day that people of this state will accept some kind of program of therapeutic abortion as just part of a birth control program. Responsible parenthood is becoming far more important than any other consideration.
Los Angeles has farmed out the dissemination of birth control information to a private group, the Planned Parenthood Organization.
Furthermore, just in straight dollars and cents, if you consider that a child from the age of 0 to 18 costs between $12,000 and $15,000 of welfare funds to support everyone child that is not wanted. Only the unwanted ones, multiplied by X numbers of thousands we don't know, can have a tremendous effect on our welfare budget.
Birth control has never been against the law in Colorado. Planned Parenthood has been providing clinical services to medically indigent women here since 1937. Official approval to tax-supported birth control programs by the passage of this 1965 Family Planning and Birth Control Act. In its final form, the law permits counties to furnish family planning information and devices to welfare recipients and other parents of married persons. Another persuasive argument made to the legislature was that a relatively small public investment in birth control would ultimately result in substantially reduced welfare costs. We asked Mrs. Sherry Eberhardt, Director of Colorado Planned Parenthood, if studies proved this.
That over a period of some 3 to 4 years, they had saved $250,000 in welfare costs in the county. That they saved, in other words, 90%.
Planned Parenthood patients also pay some fees.
I hate the idea of a private individual going to a medically indigent woman and handing her birth control absolutely free and saying, "Here, dear, you take this." What you're doing is saying, I, a member of the middle class of society, don't want you, a member of the poorer class of society, to have any more babies.
And as we're all aware, this is a problem of the poor.
That the cost of birth control programs will slowly shift to the taxpayer instead of being borne in large part by private Planned Parenthood contributions. Yet Planned Parenthood of Colorado isn't planning to go out of business.
We have a man working for us we call a field worker. He's bilingual, he speaks Spanish fluently, whose job it is to do patient recruiting. I think we will turn more and more to field service, to locating the people who really need this service.
This small blue station wagon carries a surprising cargo. Crammed into it is an almost incredible amount of medical equipment. This is the mobile unit operated by the Planned Parenthood Federation to 6 New York neighborhoods where a majority of families subsist on incomes which are officially recognized as the poverty level. All the pamphlets are in Spanish as well as English for the benefit of New York's large Puerto Rican population. The pill and the IUD are the 2 great scientific advances which have made it feasible to bring birth control within the reach of the poor, but the dedicated men and women who serve there, as at the mobile clinic, are the first to concede that the message is not reaching those who most need it, those on welfare.
Political opposition based on fear of Catholic constituents once killed the birth control program in Illinois. Now, 2 years later, the program is back in effect.
I felt that it boiled down to which was the lesser of 2 evils.
A cynical observer might interpret the turnabout in Illinois as a triumph of pocketbook over principle. Almost everywhere, the mounting costs of welfare payments are a strong political incentive.
Every southern state has a program of sorts in progress. Most of these are directed toward low-income people, and this means mostly Negroes. The Negro birth rate in Georgia, for example, is higher than the birth rate of India, which is held up to us as the prime example of reproduction beyond the capacity of the economy to handle. The Negro rate in Georgia is 31.7 per thousand of population. The white rate, 22 per thousand. In rural Harris County live 11,000 people. 5,000 of these are white, 6,000 are Negro. The Negro birth rate is double that of the white birth rate. There is no longer any reason for state government program planners to tiptoe through the problem of family planning as though it were some politically sensitive briar patch. People need help now. Results are obtainable now. In the course of our research for this program, we were surprised to learn how little would be required in the way of medical and technical costs to get into the family planning business in significant volume.
After the war, Britain loaded 20 old merchant ships with German mustard gas shells. Many dated from the First War. Tens of thousands were consigned to the seabed.
I would say that the modern era of chemotherapy in cancer, physicians became aware of the possible value of the derivatives of a war gas, sulfur mustard. Mustard gases had been known since World War I, and research on them had continued between the two world wars. Nitrogen mustards, very closely related to sulfur mustards, were absorbed through the skin and through the lungs, had a very profound effect on depressing white cell levels in the bloodstream. December of 43, the tragic sinking of a U.S. transport ship off the coast of Italy, which happened to be carrying a large cargo of sulfur mustard gas. Sailors and troops who were recovered from the water died later in hospitals in Italy with very profound depressions of their bone marrows, very low white counts. And the doctors who were in attendance at that time got the idea, quite logically, that something which had this great an effect in depressing white cell levels might have a beneficial effect in such a disease as leukemia.
The worst thing that I could do in a program like this would be to lead anyone to believe that studies like this in animals could be immediately applicable to man. They can't in numbers, because in man, a leukemic patient may have not 1 million cells, not 1.5 billion, such as kill the mouse, but they may have 10 to the 12th cells, which is a very big number. Killing 1 million cells in a mouse can't be equated with killing 1,000 billion in a man. Some of the principles involved, I hope, will be applicable.
Our guest this evening is David Rockefeller, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Mr. Rockefeller will discuss population planning and agricultural production in a speech entitled The Population Problem and Economic Development.
President Johnson has suggested that we help countries trying to control population growth by increasing our research, and that we earmark funds to help their efforts. Meaningful help to programs aimed at bringing population and food supply into balance through practical family planning. The President has given renewed emphasis to the fight against disease, supplementing the excellent programs conducted by the United Nations World Health Organization.
Smallpox vaccine is a very poor vaccine. For one reason, the duration of immunity that is afforded by the smallpox vaccination is relatively short in duration, and probably absolute immunity to smallpox from the vaccine is no longer than 3 years. There are a significant number of complications that are associated with this particular vaccine, and a significant amount of mortality. There can be no question that there are at least 7 deaths a year as a result of our smallpox vaccination policy. When you're talking about the deaths secondary to the smallpox vaccine, that you are talking in the range of 7 a year, which means over the 20 years that we have been free of smallpox, we've had probably in the range of 100 to 200 deaths as a result of the vaccine. Now, it would take an awfully large epidemic of smallpox to be able to equal that mortality. If you look carefully in terms of the immunity of the nation, you'll find that 80% of the population has not been vaccinated within 3 years, and therefore are not absolutely protected against smallpox, and 50% have not been vaccinated for greater than 15 years and probably have little or no protection at all to smallpox. The same type of experience that they've been having in the Netherlands, where it's 1 per 1,000 cases of post-vaccine encephalitis.
Tremendously impressed with the reliability of the data from the Netherlands, with their experience with armed forces groups who did not have immunization against smallpox in childhood. Their data is certainly very striking as to the difference in incidence of post-vaccinal encephalitis.
It is not necessary to perform routine smallpox vaccination.
Bulletin of the World Health Organization, 1972. Virus-associated immunopathology, animal models and implications for human disease. This memorandum reviews recent developments in viral immunopathology, with special reference to animal model systems, and indicates the possible relevance of the new concepts and techniques for certain diseases of man. Recommendations. A systematic evaluation of the effects of viruses on immune function should be undertaken. The effects of virus infection on different cell types, example, macrophages, T and B lymphocytes, should be studied in greater detail, with morphologic changes perhaps serving as an indication of functional alterations. Efforts at standardization are currently being being supported by the World Health Organization. An attempt should be made to ascertain whether viruses can in fact exert selective effects on immune function by depressing 7S versus 19S antibody, or by affecting T-cell function as opposed to B-cell function. If this proves to be the case, virus-induced immunodepression might conceivably be highly instrumental in prolonging certain virus infections, such as leukemia. If you were the World Health Organization, why would you study techniques for developing viruses harming the immune systems of humans? Why would you study prolonging disease? What are these recent developments in animal viruses that could infect humans? Does this have anything to do with those animal virus-contaminated vaccines the WHO mandated hundreds of millions across the world to take multiple times? Why does this study have no stated benefits for mankind? A scientific declaration of war upon your body's ability to be immune to the system of the World Health Organization. The eugenic concept of bad genes could finally be transferred to any individual who dared to trust a pharmaceutical product. An apple a day to keep the doctor away. Hygiene and natural immunity were winning the war against the World Health Organization. Life expectancy worldwide was at an all-time high, and a record amount of baby boomers were on track to continue the cycle of population growth. The World Health Organization's stated goal is combating diseases with mass vaccination campaigns. The World Health Organization also has a stated goal of studying the implications of animal viruses causing disease in humans. Recent developments in animal viral immunopathology derive from mass vaccinations contaminated with animal viruses, specifically 10 to 30 million people who obtained an immune-depressing cancer-causing virus, simian virus 40. The World Health Organization's mass vaccination campaigns do not eliminate disease. They create and spread new diseases. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine may have been the greatest failure in the history of science, but without a doubt, it was the greatest victory in the history of scientific eugenics.
January 12th, that's when he received his first DPT oral polio vaccine. My son the next day became ill. That night he died in my arms at home. He died in pain.
Almost every child in America gets a vaccine called DPT. That stands for diphtheria, pertussis, or whooping cough, and tetanus. In most states, you can't go to school unless you've had it. But lately, the DPT vaccine has been under fire because it's been linked to brain damage, even death in some children. Last Friday, the federal government conceded that improvements were needed in the vaccine. How safe is the DPT vaccine?
The reactions have been severe and permanent.
Since 1933, studies have shown that the whooping cough or pertussis vaccine causes brain damage. The controversy isn't really over the fact that it happens, but how often it happens, and whether it happens often enough to deem the vaccine more dangerous than the disease itself.
We had a child up to 4 months of age that was developing beautifully well. The doctor explained that he was giving Scott his first DPT shot. Between 12 and 14 hours, he gave an outburst, very hard cry. A group of doctors conferred and indicated that it was indeed the DPT shot that injured Scott.
There's no question that there is a risk. We also say that convulsions or episodes of limpness and paleness may occur after 1 in every 1,750 shots, rarely about once in every 100,000 shots. Inflammation of the brain or encephalitis may occur, and permanent brain damage may occur about once in every 310,000 shots. Recommend that children who have reacted to a first dose of vaccine should not receive a second dose.
They will not require the drug companies to do adequate surveillance of the adverse reactions which do occur. So when they say the benefits exceed the risks, they have a system that records the benefits, but they don't have a system that records the reactions. The rest of the world does not require the vaccine be given in the first place, not to give the vaccine with respect to children who are in families which have a history of convulsions or seizure disorders.
If a physician doesn't know the risk, I can blame no one but that individual physician. We do not have a test that says that a bad outcome clearly has been caused by that event.
It is discretionary in Great Britain at this moment, right?
It is and always has been. About 50% of parents have opted not to have it. You will see that there has been a steady decrease ever since about 1920 in frequency and in mortality. Now that decrease continued throughout the period when there was vaccination. After World War II, there was a baby boom and there was a great increase in cases. And what we're often seeing is just the decrease since then, which of course coincided with the period of vaccination. That side effects were much more common than was realized. That the vaccine was not very effective. The British vaccines were not controlling the disease. The risks outweigh the benefits. We know that in fully vaccinated children, and there is evidence, you know that also in the United States, that you can get very severe disease too. So that the vaccine is not all that effective. I would never make anything mandatory. Only behind the Iron Curtain that I know of any programs, medical programs, which are mandatory, apart from the somewhat indirect mandatory effect in the United States.
President Ford today urged Congress and the insurance industry not to let his program for nationwide swine flu vaccination collapse in petty wrangling. The President said the threat of swine flu epidemic is very genuine and the vaccination program is an essential public health need for all Americans. President Ford was persuaded to call for nationwide vaccination. Congress swiftly agreed to spend $135 million on the program. Drug companies raced into mass production. State and local health authorities geared up for the war on swine flu. Dr. Wolf, the President said today that the program was an essential public health need for all Americans.
Everyone shouldn't be immunized because of the problems with lack of effectiveness and safety, but I think that this reflects a continuing process over the last several months to scare the American public into thinking that 1918 is around the corner. Finally, government officials are now admitting publicly that there really was, if anything, a misleading kind of program trying to remind people of 1918. So there have been scare tactics to try and get the program passed through Congress. And the question is whether or not Congress would have appropriated the funds originally if the specter of 1918 hadn't been raised. We are about the only country in the world that is approaching this as mass immunization for the whole public.
Dr. David Sencer is head of the federal government Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. He's played a key role in organizing the national immunization program.
The cost to our economy in medical costs, loss of productivity, loss of school time of $3.8 billion. This gives us reason to do good public health preventive medicine at the present time.
What do you advise them to do?
Well, I would advise at the present time all people to be immunized as soon as the vaccines become available. We are recommending that states make plans to probably offer a second dose.
Can drug companies produce enough effective vaccine in time? They're about to stop production unless they know that they will get adequate insurance coverage. They fear they could be swamped by lawsuits arising from adverse effects. One insurance executive said that without risk sharing, the immunization program would be a bonanza for lawyers.
But the larger concern is not the medical question, but the legal one. The underwriters tell us that they just don't know how many lawsuits there will be stemming out of the swine flu program and how much it will cost to defend against and settle those lawsuits. The Congress has a great deal to do with it. The Congress that enacted the legislation authorizing the expenditure of the funds for it, purchase of the vaccine and its distribution, enacting the appropriations for it. The administration, with the backing of the Congress thus far, has really planned the program from A to Z. What the vaccine will be, how many doses of it will be produced, what it will consist of, how it should be distributed, how it should be administered. The people we insure are involved at the very beginning of that process in actually producing the vaccine. Most of the program having been planned by the government, that the government should share some of the risks associated with the program.
Why are you more worried from an insurance point of view about a program like this than, for instance, the polio immunization program in the 60s?
Well, as you point out, that the polio program was in the early 60s, 1962, 63, 13 years ago, quite a different legal climate from the one you have now. There's been an enormous change in product liability law. If you were injured by somebody's product, you had to prove that the manufacturer of that product was negligent in manufacturing. The evolution of product liability law since that time has been to hold the manufacturer progressively more frequently liable, other than the scale of it. I think the swine flu is considerably bigger, and that's a major factor.
The government has really done everything to stifle dissent on this issue. One of the leading critics of the program in the Food and Drug Administration was fired last week, shortly after he had made a public statement. And I would say that the atmosphere, both in the Center for Disease Control and in other parts of the government, is that it doesn't make sense for your own job to speak out against the program, which explains one of the reasons why there's been a lack of criticism of the program. The administrative review found that the person should not be fired. The public is being misled very much by the government, and not the first time.
I frankly myself am not sure whether I and my family should go and get this vaccine if it's available. Do you have a family, and are you going to recommend that you and your family be vaccinated?
I do have a family, including children, and I would recommend that none of them be vaccinated. The record as far as effectiveness in preventing disease, by the way, for flu vaccines is not very good, another issue.
11 more people were reported today to have died after receiving vaccinations against swine flu. 14 the deaths reported since the government's mass immunization program began 2 weeks ago. Health authorities stressed that there was no known connection between the deaths and the $135 million program. The White House said that President Ford would take his flu shot tomorrow as scheduled. Yesterday, the first 3 deaths were reported in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All died a short time after receiving the shot. State authorities immediately closed Pennsylvania's 13 swine flu vaccination centers, but soon after reopened them.
The swine flu inoculation program has been having its problems from the very beginning. Scientists concluded that there was a possibility of an epidemic this winter. They said the possibility was serious enough to launch a mass inoculation of the population. 4 major manufacturers of the vaccine said they wouldn't proceed unless fully insured from claim, and private insurance companies said they couldn't write the proper policy. The law, in short, makes the federal government liable for all claims of death or injury as a result of a swine flu inoculation. And her relatives say she was feeling great before she walked in there and got that shot, and then a few hours later she was dead.
The United States Public Health Service still recommends the vaccination.
Whether the actual program might put patients more at risk than the threat of the disease itself.
No other country has the capacity to produce enough vaccine for use by all of its inhabitants. We are fortunate enough to have 4 manufacturers who we feel can produce enough vaccine. That is why no other country has a national program.
In England, you know, they fed swine flu virus deliberately to several volunteers. They couldn't even get a bad case of flu out of the thing.
We had the program up to about 29,000 people immunized a day. Yesterday it dropped to about 24,000, and today we're down to 12,000. That the program will be hurt is no question.
That's the real problem from the average person's point of view. You say in the best judgment of the average guy, I don't know anything about medicine, and most of us don't. That doesn't do me a bit of good.
We've given you all the facts, and we've given you our own recommendations.
The flu season is upon us. Which type will we worry about this year? And what kind of shots will we be told to take? Remember the swine flu scare of 1976? That was the year the U.S. government told us all that swine flu could turn out to be a killer that could spread across the nation. And Washington decided that every man, woman, and child in the nation should get a shot to prevent a nationwide outbreak, a pandemic. Well, 46 million of us obediently took the shot. And now 4,000 Americans are claiming damages from Uncle Sam amounting to $3.5 billion because of what happened when they took that shot. By far the greatest number of the claims, 2/3 of them, are for neurological damage or even death, allegedly triggered by the flu shot.
See how easy it is to...
Thus, the U.S. government's publicity machine was cranked into action to urge all America to protect itself against the swine flu menace.
Influenza is serious business. During major flu epidemics, millions of people are sick and thousands die. Well, this year you can get protection. The vaccines are safe, easy to take, and they can protect you against flu. So roll up your sleeve. Protect yourself.
One of those who did roll up her sleeve was Judy Roberts. She was perfectly healthy, an active woman, when in November of 1976, she took her shot.
By the following week, I was totally paralyzed.
So completely paralyzed, in fact, that they had to operate on her to enable her to breathe. And for 6 months, Judy Roberts was a quadriplegic. As you can see in these home movies taken by a friend, Judy Roberts' paralysis confined her mostly to a wheelchair for over a year. Indeed, there are 300 claims now pending from the families of GBS victims who died, allegedly as a result of the swine flu shot.
Judy, why did you take the flu shot?
I'd never taken any other flu shots, but I felt like this was going to be a major epidemic. And the only way to prevent a major epidemic of a really deadly variety of flu was for everybody to be immunized.
It began right here at Fort Dixon, New Jersey in January of that year when a number of recruits began to complain of respiratory ailments, something like the common cold. An Army doctor here sent samples of their throat cultures to the New Jersey Public Health Lab to find out just what kind of bug was going around here. The New Jersey lab identified most of those soldiers' throat cultures as the normal kind of flu virus going around that year, but they could not make out what kind of virus was in the culture from the dead soldier. So they sent those cultures to the Federal Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia for further study. A few days later, they got the verdict: swine flu.
If I had known the boy had been in a sick bed, got up, went out on a forced march, and then collapsed and died, I would never have taken the shot.
Dr. David Senser, then head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, is now in private industry. He devised the swine flu program, and he pushed it. You began to give flu shots to the American people in October of 76.
October 1st.
By that time, how many cases of swine flu around the world?
None confirmed.
None confirmed. Did you ever uncover any other outbreaks of swine flu anywhere in the world?
No.
Now, nearly everyone was to receive the shot in a public health facility where a doctor might not be present. Therefore, it was up to the CDC to come up with some kind of official consent form, giving the public all the information it needed about the swine flu shot. This form stated that the swine flu vaccine had been tested. What it didn't say was that after those tests were completed, the scientists developed another vaccine, and that was the one given to most of the 46 million who took the shot. That vaccine was called X53A. Was X53A ever field tested?
I don't know.
I would think that you're in charge of the program.
I haven't looked at this in some time.
The consent form was also supposed to warn people about any risks of serious complications following the shot.
Yes, I looked at that document. I signed it. Nothing on there said I was going to have a heart attack or I get Guillain-Barré, which I never heard of.
Did anyone ever come to you and say, there's the possibility of neurological damage if you get into a mass immunization program?
No.
Do you know Michael Hatwick?
Yes.
Dr. Michael Hatwick directed the surveillance team for the swine flu program at the CDC. His job was to find out what possible complications could arise from taking the shot and to report his findings to those in charge. Did you know ahead of time that there had been case reports of neurological disorders associated with the injection of influenza vaccine?
Absolutely.
How'd you know that?
By review of the literature.
So you told your superiors about the possibility of neurological disorders?
Absolutely.
What would you say if I told you that your superiors say that you never told them about the possibility of neurological complications?
That's nonsense. I can't believe that they would say that they did not know that there were neurological illnesses associated with influenza vaccination. That simply is not true. We did know that.
Why does this report from your own agency, dated July 1976, list neurological complications as a possibility? You didn't feel it was necessary to tell the people that information?
I think that over the years we have tried to inform the American people as fully as possible.
Dr. Sensor's CDC also helped create the advertising to get the public to take the shot. Let me read to you from one of your own agency's memos planning the campaign to urge Americans to take the shot. The swine flu vaccine has been taken by many important persons, he wrote. Example, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, Elton John, Muhammad Ali, Mary Tyler Moore, Rudolph Nureyev, Walter Cronkite, Ralph Nader, Edward Kennedy. True?
I'm not familiar with that particular piece of paper, but I do know that at least of that group, President Ford did take the vaccination.
Did you talk to these people beforehand to find out if they planned to take the shot?
I did not know.
Did anybody?
I do not know.
Did you get permission to use their names in your campaign?
I do not know.
Mary, did you take a swine flu shot?
No, I did not.
Did you give them permission to use your name saying that you had or were going to?
Absolutely not. Never did.
Did you ask your own doctor about taking the swine flu shot?
Yes, and at the time he thought it might be a good idea, but I resisted it because I was leery of having the symptoms that sometimes go with that kind of inoculation.
So you didn't?
No, I didn't.
Have you spoken to your doctor since?
Yes.
And?
He's delighted that I didn't take that shot.
I'll be happy to take responsibility for it.
I am a little more adamant in my thoughts than my wife is, because I told Judy to take the shot. She wasn't going to take it, and she never had shots. I'm mad with my government because they knew the facts, but they didn't release those facts because if they had released them, the people wouldn't have taken. And they can come out tomorrow and tell me there's going to be an epidemic, and they can drop off like flies next to me. I will not take another shot that my government tells me to take.
What we're doing here today is more important than the Vietnamese War. It's more important than dealing with racism, than dealing with sexism, than dealing with hunger, because I can feel hunger. I can see war. I can feel racism. I can feel sexism. I cannot see radiation. I cannot smell radiation. I cannot hear radiation. I look around one day and I am dead. Somewhere you have to. Somewhere you have to. So I say to you today, when you leave here, you have to give radiation an odor. You have to give radiation a sound. You have to give radiation a smell. So go back into your community and be willing to go to jail if it comes to that, because I'd rather see you in jail with the jails filled up than the graveyards running over. We have a choice.